On April 26, U.S. President Joe Biden issued his strongest commitment to South Korean ally, warning that North Korea would face an endgame if it carried out any nuclear attack against Washington or Seoul. Biden's comments came as the two leaders announced the Washington Declaration, in which the U.S. provided South Korea with a firm nuclear umbrella. In turn, South Korea reaffirmed its decision to abandon plans to develop a domestic nuclear weapons program. However, does the strong commitment of a nuclear umbrella that Washington offers to Seoul help alleviate the anxiety of the South Korean people? In the economic sphere, President Yoon also did not achieve the expected results during his U.S. visit. How exactly did that happen? As the warmth of the sun in Washington fades, President Yoon faces the cold reception from his own people back home. What has happened? Please join us to find out more in FBNC's World Affairs. After being warmly welcomed by U.S. President Joe Biden at the White House, President Yoon Suk-yeol received a cold and icy reception upon returning to his homeland of South Korea, according to a New York Times commentary. The U.S. newspaper states that President Yoon's foreign policy, which aims to bring Seoul closer to Washington and Tokyo, has caused divisions in South Korea. President Yoon Suk-yeol went to Washington to reset South Korean diplomacy by drawing closer to the United States. President Biden welcomed him as "my friend." Mr. Yoon belted out American Pie while the crowd whooped along during the White House dinner. "Even if you didn't know my name, you may know BTS and Blackpink," Mr. Yoon said to jockeys from American lawmakers. "BTS beat me to the White House, but I beat them to Capitol Hill." But Mr. Yoon now returns home to South Korea to a decided colder audience, a public that has punished him with low approval ratings, and in some sectors has deep misgivings over a pivot toward the United States that could alienate China and threaten the country's long tradition of diplomatic caution. Even before Mr. Yoon departed for Washington, South Koreans were beginning to grapple with questions that seemed distant until recently. How can they feel safe under the rapidly expanding nuclear threat from North Korea? And how should they navigate the increasingly bitter rivalry between the United States, South Korea's main military ally, and China, its biggest trading partner? The main answer Mr. Yoon is bringing home is the Washington Declaration, a joint statement with Mr. Biden. In it, Biden promised that Washington could embrace South Korea as a close consultative partner in its nuclear strategy over the Korean Peninsula, though American presidents will remain the sole authority on whether to actually use nuclear weapons. To show its extended deterrence commitment to defend its ally with nuclear weapons if necessary, Mr. Biden promised that U.S. nuclear ballistic missile submarines would make port calls in South Korea for the first time in decades. In turn, Mr. Yoon reaffirmed South Korea's intention not to develop nuclear weapons on its own, dispelling misgivings in Washington that he might consider a nuclear option, as he indicated he might early this year. Everything President Yoon has done since taking office last year has received mixed opinions in South Korea. His visit to the U.S. and the nuclear commitments made by Washington for South Korea under Yoon's tenure are no exception. The Washington Declaration was a big win for South Korea because for the first time, the allies are discussing nuclear deterrence, which Seoul has not been able to discuss with Washington until now, said Kim Yoon, a Seoul-based researcher for the Center for a New American Security. They are gaming out scenarios in which not only North Korea might use a nuclear weapon, but the U.S. would direct the employment of a nuclear weapon in response as well. Ms. Kim said, "This is huge because until now, the tabletop exercises would end before Washington decides to use a nuclear weapon. The U.S. had considered such information to be too classified to share, and because nuclear use would be a U.S. decision, operation, and execution plan." Mr. Yoon's critics at home, however, felt he was giving away too much for too little. Seeing the declaration and a separate joint statement from Mr. Yoon and Mr. Biden as a carefully wrote designed to silence calls for South Korea's own nuclear force or the redeployment of American tactical nuclear weapons in the South. The Washington Declaration may look substantive and fantastic, but in reality it is an empty shell, said Professor Kim Dong-yup at the University of North Korean Studies in Seoul. There is no change in Washington policy. Critics also doubted that the port calls by U.S. nuclear submarines would do much more than further escalate regional tensions with China and North Korea and provide another excuse for the North to expand its nuclear arsenal. On Saturday, North Korea called Mr. Yoon a fool and Mr. Biden an old man with no future, and said it felt compelled to take more decisive action. They are not extended deterrence, but rather extended crisis, Mr. Kim said. An editorial in the conservative daily Chosun Ilbo sounded miffed by what is called the Biden administration's effort to tighten the nuclear shackles on its ally. The declaration seems to put more emphasis on American concerns that South Korea could develop its own nuclear weapons than on the North Korean nuclear threat that prompts such aspirations, it said. Ultimately, South Korea must be in the position to defend itself. Carl Freithof, an expert at Chicago Council on Global Affairs, believes that the biggest issue with the Washington Declaration is that it is not a treaty, meaning that the commitments within it could become worthless if the U.S. political landscape changes after the 2024 presidential election. A prominent candidate in this election is Donald Trump, who significantly reduced joint military exercises with South Korea during his tenure and even caused controversy by demanding that Seoul contribute more to the cost of U.S. forces stationed in the country. According to expert Freithof, the scenario of Trump returning to the White House would likely ignite very serious discussions in Seoul. Therefore, this analyst believes that biggest challenge facing the U.S.-South Korea nuclear umbrella is something that neither country can control, which is the internal political situation in the U.S. South Korea's defense strategy relied on the assumption that the United States would come to its aid if war were to break out, but the once bedrock premise is losing its credibility. In a survey by the Seoul-based Che Institute for Advanced Studies late last year, nearly 49% of respondents said they doubted that Washington would fight for South Korea at the risk of a North Korean nuclear attack on mainland United States. Nearly 77% said South Korea needed to develop its own nuclear arsenal. Many South Koreans remain wary of great powers, reflecting their deep grievances over Japanese colonial rule and the division of the Korean Peninsula by the Soviet Union and the United States at the end of World War II. South Korea has kept Japan at arm's length, even though Washington urged its two key allies to work closely together to deter China and North Korea. It has also sought diplomatic balance between Washington and Beijing. Its more progressive leaders, like Mr. Yoon's predecessor Moon Jae-in, doggedly pursued dialogue with North Korea, even causing friction with Washington, which tended to emphasize sanctions. Mr. Yoon, however, has made a point of shaking the traditional equilibrium. In March, he broke a logjam in relations with Japan by promising that Seoul will no longer seek compensation for victims of forced labor during Japan's colonial rule. Mr. Yoon also doggedly aligned Seoul more closely with the United States, despite concerns about China's ability to harm South Korea's vital economy. The alliance now has become a global alliance that safeguards freedom and peace around the world, he told the U.S. Congress. Korea will fulfill its responsibilities. While in Washington, Mr. Yoon condemned the war against Ukraine as a violation of international law. In a jab at Beijing, he opposed any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the Indo-Pacific. including through unlawful maritime claims, the militarization of reclaimed features, and coercive activities. Liberal South Koreans cautioned against Mr. Yoon's approach. If South Korea is unilaterally sucked into the new US-led Cold War system, it must face up to the reality that relations with China and Russia, both of which have a strong influence on North Korea, will become more dangerous, and the risk of a North Korean nuclear crisis and even war all around the peninsula will increase. But to many South Koreans, especially younger generations, struggling with the dwindling job opportunities, a more pressing issue than the North's nuclear arsenal is the economy. In recent months, hardly a day has gone by in South Korea without headlines blaring concern that Mr. Biden's Inflation Reduction and Chips and Science Acts would hurt two of the South Koreans' most important industries, electric cars and semiconductors. But in their joint statement, Mr. Yoon and Mr. Biden only agreed to continue close consultations. Younger Koreans don't know the lyrics to American Pie, but they know about the Inflation Reduction Act, Mr. Luluri said. The Nikkei Asia comments that the summit fell short of the South Korean business community's expectations when it came to American concessions on the economic security front. Besides traditional security, U.S. semiconductor restrictions targeting China were a major topic of discussion at the talks. Wary of China's buildup of cheap expertise, the Biden administration last October sharply limited the transfer of advanced semiconductor technology to China. This left South Korea's Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix unable to make additional investments in their Chinese chip plants. The South Korean government has conveyed their concern to Washington, and the two sides have been negotiating an easing of the provisions. These discussions have not borne much fruit so far, at least judging by the joint statement released Wednesday. The statement said that Yoon and Biden appreciated the recent efforts made by the ROK and the United States to alleviate concerns of Korean businesses over recently passed American legislation, and that the two leaders committed to continue close consultations. The principal economic secretary who accompanied Yoon to Washington said that the summit only outlined a broad framework and that relevant ministries will begin to discuss details with an eye toward preventing disruptions to capital spending by South Korean companies. Another big issue is the thick barriers that the U.S. government has put up for electric vehicle subsidies. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, EVs must be exempted in North America to qualify for the tax credit, sparking concern that Hyundai Motor Group models will be left out. Hyundai has endeavored to win Washington's favor. When Biden visited South Korea in May 2022, the company announced plans to spend several $billions in the U.S. On Tuesday, Hyundai said it and SK On would jointly spend $5 billion on battery cell plant in the American state of Georgia. Hyundai may qualify for future incentives, but Washington's visible prioritization of American companies has planted seeds of distrust. In economic security, one tangible result of the summit will be the creation of a consultative body for strategic goods. Senior security officials from both sides will take part in the so-called next-generation critical and emerging technologies dialogue. Although not much has emerged from the bilateral discussions on the economic security front, U.S. and South Korean companies have been active in making investments. About $11 billion in investments were announced during Yoon's visit. General Motors and battery maker Samsung SDI said they will build a joint venture plant on American soil. Netflix said it will spend $2.5 billion in South Korea over 4 years. U.S. specialty glass producer Corning announced a $1.5 billion investment in South Korean facilities. This activity indicates that U.S. and South Korean businesses are expanding partnerships in a variety of sectors, even amid stalled progress by the two governments on resolving their clashing interests in economic security. On April 28, the chairman of the opposition Democratic Party in South Korea, Mr. Lee Jae-myung, criticized President Yoon for not protecting the country's industries and domestic companies. South Korean's Yonhap Shinmun newspaper wrote, "The concern is that the government is falling into a state of dependence on the U.S. South Korea is losing its autonomy in diplomacy and security, as it rarely refuses requests from Washington. The American pie belongs to the U.S. alone, while for other countries, it is merely a pie in the sky." This has come to an end of our program today. Thanks for watching, and please tune in next time.